Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled to be talking again to the wonderful Sam Reid all about Interview with the Vampire. And one of the things that I loved seeing through all of these episodes this season was it was really just building upon that idea of how we see Lestat through other characters' perspectives. And I was interested in the aspects of playing to Louis, envisioning him in all these scenes, because there's elements where it's the version of events that Louis remembers and his memories. But then there's also these really interesting tangents where it's almost conversations with his inner critic and his inner voice that he's having with himself, but it's easier to conjure Lestat as the voice of disagreement for him. And I was
Yeah.
interested in that side of things also being at play for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's really interesting is it's always a big conversation because I usually have a lot of questions. And I think particularly as this kind of thread of Louis becoming a photographer and exploring his kind of like journey to be an artist, or whether or not he is an artist, or whether or not he's like, a really kind of astute businessman, which I think is what he sort of finds is that he's got this thread, but he explores being an artist. And my response to that was that I think Lestat would be very kind of encouraging of Louis to have that exploration in himself. And so obviously my instincts were, well, let's like make Lestat like really into it. Let's make him and want to and you want to kill anybody who says that Louis is not a good photographer. And then obviously, they have to pair that back and be like, well, I'm not playing Lestat, I'm playing Louis. And who Louis is going to turn to for the most honest opinion on his work, um, and somebody who he feels, that there's a level of sort of unbreakable trust. And so, for Roland and Levin, I think, throughout that process, were always telling me to kind of actually be more cutthroat with the way that he's critiquing his work, because he's the only person who's going to give him the truth. Um, and and obviously that's Louis looking at his own work and saying, actually, it's pretty average. So it's a very complex thing because you're trying to show that there is this kind of deep love between these two characters. There is a sweetness, there's a kindness, and you don't want to hurt the feelings of the ones that you love. Obviously, these guys hurt each other all the time, and that's kind of part of their MO. But in terms of like trying to kind of be supportive of Louis' art, but also really having to drive the narrative and the story forward and using Lestat as a very specific device. So it's complex. And I always sort of rail against it because I'm always a bit like, is this kind of like setting us back? And are people going to be able to understand that we're not using Lestat as Lestat here, but we're using him as the kind of like framework in which Louis needs to to discover more about himself? It's kind of messy, but fun.
And I know that you always think very specifically about where the more heightened elements can kind of come into play, and that often it's the external forces or the tone around it, but playing everything very real. But when you're playing Lestat through someone's memories, did
Yeah.
you find that there were moments where it made more sense to be a bit more heightened with some of his emotions? Because again, it's all about perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like, you just go back to the book, the first book, and the way that she sort of like describes Lestat, or the way Louis describes Lestat, it's like there's a lot of like very hyperbolic sort of descriptions that, you can lean into. I mean, we don't go with like the dried twig. I mean, I actually think that we mention it in the first season, but like how that he does need to feel very extreme and on the edge, on the fringes of like what is acceptable and how much you can actually deal with him, because he is processed through like, a bunch of people who he's hurt in those first two seasons. So you don't really have any quiet moments with him. But, Roland also, he's very adamant that the character does experience things at the height and at the highest level at which one can experience it, to the point where like, so we have to push it to the point like, is this is this believable? Can I believe it? Like, and it's but what it does is it creates a facility for a character to kind of go there to the extremes, and allows the show to kind of push to the parameters. Um, you know, and so like and Roland uses him as that device. One thing I always think about in this regard is like, there's this beautiful scene that Assad has, and he kind of like talks about his past, and you learn about Arun, and you see the painting behind him, and Lestat in the script is kind of like bubbling, boiling, boiling, bubbling, 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 looking at Louis. Louis is potentially going falling for it, bubbling, 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 and then just goes screams like ha at the end of it. And I felt I felt like it was a very complex thing to do to Armand in that scene, because it's such a beautiful speech, and you kind of just want to sit with it, and you want to sit with that character and remember what you've seen or you've heard. But Roland keeps pushing us, or keeps pushing the audience to remember that these characters are sitting on the fringes of the extremity of emotion. So when they draw you in, it's also an artifice, even if they're becoming very small and becoming very, they're monsters, and so it should feel very jarring, and you should hate the stuff in that moment, because you should feel seduced by Armand. But that's Louis who's doing that. That's Louis who actually doesn't believe him, because he knows he's in another, like, bullshit relationship, basically. It's like, they're very smart, these writers. I mean, they're just like, and it's hard to, I feel like I'm always like a couple of steps behind, because you're trying to like make sense of what you have to do as just a, you know run-of-the-mill actor in a scene. Like, how am I going to make this work? Like, what's my intention? Like, all the basic questions, but they're always operating on a much higher meta level that requires some sort of push and pull. I don't know.
There's also the aspect of when we first see Lestat stepping onto stage, that it's again it's someone else's perspective of, oh, he loves being on stage and look at the charisma and the way that he's commanding the entire audience, but it's actually also a place that is uncomfortable and has trauma associated with him as
Yeah,
well, and then he develops more trauma, as we see in those last couple of episodes. And so
yeah.
how did you set about looking at the different dynamics and kind of the different ways that he's presenting on stage with all of that in mind?
Well, they all have trauma. I mean, I guess, and I think you've got to find ways to make trauma interesting and fun, because also if you do a whole show based on trauma, I mean, but the thing is, they're vampires, and that's a wonderful premise for us to kind of explore the more darker, tormented aspects of humanity, um, and just find ways to reflect that, and find lightness in it. But with the theater, like, it's actually more about his relationship with Armand than it is about his what Lestat's relationship with the theater is. Um, and like, there's a very it's a very pointed choice to make him Arlecchino or Harlequin, in that space, because it's not necessarily how Lestat kind of gets engulfed in the world of theater. I mean, this guy is like a hypersexualized person, not necessarily by his own design, but when you try and find out, when you're discovering things about yourself in a very formative ages, and you learn that a lot of your power comes from like the desire of other people, be that well, yeah, anyway, desire, yeah, whatever. Well, I won't go too far into that one, because, but I think when we look at the theater, like, what we're really trying to show is that this is like a little, like a seductive being just walking around owning everybody else, which is how Armand sees him. So he's just like, he's there kind of like prancing and preening and kind of writhing all over the stage and seducing the audience, and like making him feel seen, and making him want him and desire him. And that is like the superficial level of Lestat's trauma as well. But we don't really dig into that there, because, like, Lestat is, an object of desire to a lot of people and a lot of creatures. And through that, want of him, he ends up finding himself in some pretty shit situations. But particularly there, so I didn't really want to kind of, you know play too much into more than the fact that he's just being that object of seduction for Armand in this kind of artificial character, this thing that he never did. He played this character that he never did this thing that he never did. But it's the idea, the feeling is there, you know. Um, uh, but going back, when we go back onto the stage, I mean, yeah, so there's that other thing that, that we will find out a little bit more about it, but that he created this world, as we know in season two, he built this world. He was a part of building this world that is eventually a prison that, is kind of like a central theme throughout the whole show in general, like the whole thing, because and it's a metaphor for a lot of stuff, but you're you are the thing that you're pretending to be by saying that you're not, you know? So you like the only way that you can own who you are is by saying, I am that thing, but it's so absurd that no one will believe you. And what about if somebody does believe you? But the thing is that perhaps you don't believe it yourself. Or perhaps you're too ashamed of it yourself to actually be honest about it, or so it's a prison. There's like it's a prison that they've created so for vampires to exist in society because vampires are too extreme. It's a and it's great. It's sort of like like there's like lots of sort of representations of this in culture and art and stuff or through society where you know people are put on stage in the most extreme version of them of their true selves, and that's the only way that society can deal with it and accept it. Whereas when they go backstage, they're still the same people that they were on stage, but they're probably just playing a heightened version of themselves. It's like they never get to pull the mask off. They never get to show their true self. Anyway, that's fine.
I love
No
it.
rambling. My rambling there about vampire theater.
I love it so much. And again, because nothing is ever straightforward with any of the scenes for you in this
Uh,
show, there's also the element throughout the entire trial at the theater where there's what was scripted, what was presented to him, what is Armand's retelling of this, and then where are the moments where Lestat has gone completely off script. And so,
mm.
how did you work through all of those scenes and kind of figure out which version of the truth was going to happen at any given moment?
Quite fastidious. Like, I mean, I get like Hannah Moscovich gave me the original, I have the original script. So I mean, so I know what he's supposed to say, I know when he's meant to deviate. And then there was some, like some negotiations where I was a bit like, I think it should be a deviation, even though in the script it wasn't, or things like that. So we did really mark it out. I think it had to be very clear for me. Um, when he's off camera. Also, so that the other actors on stage, could respond to me like look at each other, and when they're meant to be like nodding along. You don't always see it because it's kind of like it would pull the rug away from the deception. So you don't always see it. So you just gotta like I'm playing it, but we don't edit it that way. So, it's kind of messy and complex, but that's the way that memory works. And that is like that's the major challenge of the show. And I remember having very early on in season one, having this conversation with Alan Taylor, um, being like, but he's not like this. And he was like, yeah, but don't do that. Just do it what serves do what serves the story. And I was like, oh, okay, do it serves the story. But then as we get more and more perspectives in it, and you're kind of getting a little bit of Armand's perspective, and you're getting a little bit of reading Claudia's diary, and you're getting so then you're gonna have to be like, okay, I gotta start feeding in what really happened, or things that maybe somebody else saw, or because then Malloy's getting pieces of information from the Talamasca, so you get more freedom to be like, okay, well, maybe he wasn't able to fully stand up in this point, or like maybe there was something else going on. But it's fun, it is a fun. It sounds very complex, but it's kind of fun, and everyone's sort of on board with it. I think now as we progress, I think we also have to remember to give the characters agency. So you're not trying to play against particularly Louis with season one or two. You're not trying to play against Louis's agency and just make him a liar. I mean, that would be very detrimental to the story and to the character and very not very satisfying for an audience. So you want to make sure that like there's truth in what he's saying. You can't be like everything he's said is a lie, because that would just be. I would be really pissed off if I was an audience member at the end of it. I would be like, well, what the hell was that all for?
And it was all a dream.
Yeah, and it was all a dream, and I woke up and everything's different. But yeah.
And I've heard you say that with the trial as well, you very much felt that Lestat is originally there because there's this sense of revenge, but, it's also his opportunity to see Louis again. But that the moment that he looks at Louis, that kind of changes things for him. And I was interested in if there was a particular moment or a particular beat of all those events where you felt like things had probably changed for him.
Yeah, I mean that's the way it was written. And so there's also have to really honor what Roland has written. Uh I think, in to get him to the trial is very complex. I think, the way that we kind of, particularly when you're looking at these older monsters like Armand and Lestat and, Marius and Akasha, and if you start looking at these like older kind of beasts, they've got more, there's a level of intensity and kind of like necessity that drives them forward through their relationships. It's like I have to, if my children are dying, I have to be there, you know. And so I think that's the kind of like I was like, okay, and that's something I worked out with Emma Freeman because I was a bit like, why the hell is he there? Why did he go? Like, why is he there if we're not, in the books it's much clearer because you kind of you know why he went there. But because we've changed the context and we're doing an adaptation, you can't necessarily just use that reasoning. So why has he gone there? Well, I think you kind of have to go because the love for these characters is so deep. So if they're going to die, he's going to be there. If they're going to be killed, he's going to be there. And I think that is a hard thing for a human mind, and that's where we have to go. It's a monster choice. This is a monster choice, and let's dig into that. Let's hold that. And so when is the moment when the monster falls apart and the human love and compassion and connection and the thing that, that sparkly thing that keeps Louis and Lestat, together, because we call it a vampire bond, but there's a lot of vampires that have a lot of bonds with each other, but this one seems to be specifically intense. So, when it is, and in the script it's written, it's like when they turn to look at each other. And I think that's why we very specifically don't look at each other for the whole time. And so then you're like, okay, they look at each other, and then whatever they thought, whatever Lestat thought was going to be able, how he was going to be able to do it, he's now improvising. I think he had a plan before, and that plan is not going to work. Which is really fun because that's when it starts to become like a hurricane. That's becomes a whirlwind, and the negotiations, whatever negotiations he's had with Armand previously, fall out the window, and we can start to get really, really messy with the show.
And we see so much more in terms of his relationship with Claudia. And, we understand the love that genuinely exists there and the fact that she was a child to him. And, we get to see in that final episode the impact of having watched her die on stage in that moment as well. And when he was turning her for Louis, he has that whole conversation about all the things that she's going to become and why it's a terrible idea. And did you think also that with him being the one to turn her, that some of it becomes a fear of, she's going to be like me in all these ways that I detest in myself as well?
Yes, but yes. Mm. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know necessarily if Lestat's. I mean, I wish that's great. I wish I did that, but but I think it's more important to like go back to when Lestat sees Louis for the first time. In our show, he sees him pull a knife on his brother. It's being a vampire is very hard, so you got to be able to have a level of ruthlessness in you. Um, and Lestat doesn't know anything about Claudia. When she turns up, she's, half dead already, and it's purely out of guilt. And she's too young for all intents and purposes. Lestat's never known a vampire turned that young before. It's told to him it's a very bad idea, and he's had a lot or some very intense experience of turning other people who, who should not have been turned into a vampire, and it that going very, very, very badly. So he has experience in this regard, and is incredibly painful. And to love somebody and to see them turn to not be able to deal with immortality, basically. So that's more what he's trying to say is like this is going to go so badly, and she's going to have a shit life. I mean, horrendous life. And it's going to destroy you because she's going to live forever. There's no end to this. This is like it's like saying like a puppy's for Christmas. And a puppy isn't just for Christmas. A puppy is forever. Well, this is like a vampire fledgling isn't just for Christmas. A vampire fledgling is eternal. You'll be with the suffering forever. It's kind of like that. Um, the funny thing is that because he doesn't have any context about Claudia, he doesn't realize that actually she's probably the best vampire that could have ever been made. She is so capable. She's so ready to. And I think what we don't see is that, and we do start to get an inkling and more and more and more is that, and particularly I think you get that sense of it when she dies and when he's there at her death because she's so strong in her death. And I think that is that moment where it's like, I've really, I've really messed up because this Claudia is probably my proudest, you know, thing that I've been a part of. She is the perfect vampire. And Louis is that who he thought was going to be the perfect vampire has to go through this huge journey and is not, and he really struggles with it. He hates Lestat for what he's done to him. And then obviously at the end, then he's come to realize the power that it's given him and he's found it on his own outside of the constraints of which Lestat's put him on to learn about it. But yeah. So I think in that scene, that turning, as much as I wish it was about Lestat going like, don't make her like me, don't make it. It's actually she's not saying that. She's like, she's not going to be able to survive this. Also looking at Louis, because like he's not functioning very well either. Like he's not doing a great job either. So yeah.
And in episode 8, and seeing Louis and Lestat reunited, and it's been several decades since they've seen each other, it was so interesting seeing the energy that you brought into him and in your performance in that moment. There's almost this placid feeling to him of just everything that he's been carrying and just the weight of the world has actually hit him. And then watching the two of them have this moment where they both apologize and there's an element of forgiveness as well. How did you find where you felt like he was going to be 70 years later?
Well, I mean, Lestat doesn't really apologize, and I don't know if he's necessarily in that space just yet because I don't know if he's. I mean, Lestat apologizes in the trial, and I think he feels sorry when he was killed. I mean, he apologizes, so he does apologize to a degree, but obviously, like everything that happened post the trial and everything, it's like I think he's still processing that. I think it was very, you know, Louis had a sort of a way like he had a lot of violence to be able to deal with the way that Claudia was killed. And then he went into that kind of sort of strange sort of mind warp world with Armand, which anyway, that's his story. But let's start. So stuff happened when he comes back to New Orleans that we don't see and we won't know about just yet. But so he's he's like there is like a vagrant part of the character that does turn up in the later books that we're kind of like trying to bring in tastes of, so you can believe that this kind of very outlandish sort of like performative theatrical vampire can also like kind of put on a backpack and kind of like just go hiking, because it's not something that you kind of sense that he'll do. But so kind of bring in that part of him, the one that will just disappear. um and you know but I think the thing is, like, when you're playing these characters, because they kind of live forever and they just keep enduring, they keep going, they keep going. They're just never going to stay the same. They always have to be a product of their experience. Um, and he's like living in his sort of in his own personal ghost era, basically. Yeah. And so, it's like Miss Havisham. But he's choosing to live like Miss Havisham as well, because there's also you must remember that Lestat's also quite decadent in his experience, in his feelings. He loves to feel. And so, to actually have an experience of an emotion kind of just get you through the endurance of time. So, that's what I love about that scene is like he's totally gone, but he's also wearing designer shoes. And he's got like this like big, fancy like $20,000 speakers behind him. So there's something interesting to unpick there. I'm not sure. Yeah.
And lastly, there's the fact that Lestat admits that he could never get Louis to love him and return his feelings the way that he needed, and so he broke him on purpose. And it's always been a thing with Lestat that he has this fear of being unlovable. And do you find often that it's easier for him to kind of play with people's emotions and to break them than it is to try to see if they would ever love the true version of who he is?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's to necessarily intentionally break them. But you have a character. There's got some very fucked up fundamental things that happened to him. Um, and which maybe we can talk about next year. But like I think, but I think there is a major through line to this character that cannot feel cannot believe that somebody could actually truly just love him for who he is. And he never got that experience before he turned into a mega monster. Do you know what I mean? So once you're a mega monster, then it's even harder. So he does really try. He really tried with Louis to hide that part of him because he did think he was like, okay, I'm gonna be in love. I am in love. Like I want him to love me for who I am. But so he hid all of these parts of himself. He hid all of these kind of like really terrifying things that he could do. And then they all come out in these like really unfortunate moments when, he's not dealt with the way that his reactionary kind of like, way to operating things. So I don't know if he's doing it intentionally, but it's also his, cycle, his repetitive doom pattern that he's in, that they're all in.
I always find the level to which you've analyzed this character so incredible. So thank you so much for talking about all of this, Sam. Appreciate it.
No, thanks. I love the questions. I'm glad I had my coffee this morning. Yeah.